Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Today we are here together for our monthly appointment organized by Twinning Europe. My name is Marta, and I'm pleased to host this event today with my colleague Nikos in the background. Just a practical information for the audience, the webinar is recorded and the recording might be used for dissemination purposes. And please, if you have comments, questions, post them in the chat and we'll keep track of them and we will address all of them towards the end of the webinar. In this webinar, we will explore different ways in which teachers and vocational schools or training centers can directly share good practices. We will explore together what is to be gained from sharing concrete practices rather than limiting our sharing to general models of pedagogy or standards. We will put together our experience of different tools or media for sharing and evaluate what works best for different kinds of practice. Certainly, we will not do this alone. That's why I'm pleased to introduce our guest speaker today, Julian Stanley. He works at the European Training Foundation in Italy, where he initially coordinated ETF's international survey into vocational teachers involving 9 countries. And he has supported the professional development at the level of policy and practices in relation to teachers' placements in industry, innovations in pedagogy, school-based professional development, and teacher and school networks. Most recently, Julian has worked on the development of a self-assessment tool for the ETF's network of Center of Vocational Excellence, and as part of a team that is supporting innovation in teaching and learning in vocational and lifelong learning. But without further ado, I would like now to give the floor. Please, Julian, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Marta, and thank you very much, everyone, for coming along this afternoon and finding time to join the discussion. And I'm hoping that there'll be opportunities for you to share your views as we go along. So be ready to contribute. My work at ETF has been very often at policy level. And we've been very much encouraged to think about how good practices in teaching and learning can be shared at a high level from country to country. But my own background is as a teacher. I mean, I spent the first 18 years of my career as a teacher in various different schools, teaching different subjects. And I've always got a little bit of kind of doubt and hesitation about the extent to which successful pedagogies can be transferred at a high level from one country to another or from one system to other systems. And it does seem to me to be increasingly possible for particular good practices to be shared between teachers, not only within a particular school, but from school to school or within networks in other ways. So I want to explore with you, this afternoon, how that can work and what the different ways are and what perhaps is most attractive for you. Just to go back though to start off with, what are the different ways in which we might try to change or to improve teaching? Well, I mean, I think obviously, I think all of us would be ready to admit that we need our teaching sometimes to be refreshed and updated. If we're a vocational teacher, then the skills and the tasks which are required for particular jobs change, new jobs come along, new technologies come along, so we need to update our technical, our vocational and professional knowledge, which is often pretty difficult if we're inside a school and we've been in the school for 20 years and we haven't got so much contact with the professional world. A second idea, which is quite popular amongst policymakers, but maybe less popular amongst teachers, is the notion of leveling up the quality of teachers. However, it has to be said that research does show that there's a variable, there's a lot of variability in the attainment of students, who are taught by different teachers. And I think it's evident that teachers at the beginning of their career are going to have less competence, less experience, and that some teachers perhaps are teaching a subject for which they haven't got very good training or they haven't got a good experience, and therefore there are obviously opportunities for helping the weaker teachers teach, or the less experienced teachers teach as well as the stronger teachers. Meeting new challenges and opportunities. Evidently, even very strong teachers, even up-to-date teachers, meet new challenges. Perhaps already some of you will be teaching refugees from Ukraine. Perhaps you're teaching children who've only arrived as asylum seekers from another country with different languages and aspirations. So these are new challenges. And of course, COVID has taught us all that sometimes we need to acquire new educational technologies just in order to sort of keep up with what we were doing before. And then, of course, lastly, there's another idea much beloved of policymakers, the idea of innovation. The idea that perhaps we can come up with new ways of teaching, or new kinds of learning, or new variations on what we've done before, and these are totally new. And then these can be exchanged between us and have benefits. So these are some of the kind of changes that we might want to spread, and which we might want to find ways of sharing between us. Well, what are the kind of standard ways in which we might have this kind of sharing? Well, I mean, one sort of quite popular way is this idea that we can generalize teaching practices into a method or into a pedagogy, and then promote it. So, for example, we might say, well, what we want, and this is a common idea in Europe, is we want more learner-centered teaching, or we want more active learning, or we want more personalized learning. Okay. And then, we can promote these ideas and try and encourage, by one means or another, teachers to change their approach. Okay. Now, um, there are perhaps some problems with this approach. I mean, the obvious problem is that it's relatively easy for teachers to say they're attracted to these ideas, that they believe in these approaches, but it's a lot more difficult for them actually to do them. And surveys show that the vast majority of teachers are committed to personalized learning. They're committed to learner-centered teaching, but they admit that in their daily practice they don't always manage to actually use them. So there can be a little bit of a gap between the idea and the practice. Another idea is what's called teaching standards. So what you do is you define what competencies you want, or what levels of performance you want from teachers. Maybe it's a national level, and then you try and use that standard in order to design the training, or in some cases even to license teachers. What you say is, well, unless teachers meet these standards, we won't license them to teach. Or even sometimes you say we will relicense them. If they don't continue to meet these standards, we will disqualify them from teaching. I mean, I have to say that these approaches are generally not very successful. They're enormously bureaucratic and slow, and perhaps not really very efficient ways of raising standards in teaching. But there have been times when policymakers have pushed them quite hard. Then, of course, professional development, which is supposed to address the needs of teachers, but also the priorities of school and government. And then another way, which is sometimes used perhaps a little bit odd to try and change teaching, is to change the curriculum. So what people do is they say, well, we need to be teaching different kinds of competence. So, for example, 21st century skills, or learning to learn, or I don't know, problem solving. And or we need to bring employers in to define the curriculum. And then the implication is that with these changes in the curriculum, that in turn will make teaching change. The teachers will have to change their approaches in order to teach these new curriculum. So these are all ways in which efforts are made to kind of systematically change teaching and learning, but right the way across all schools. Okay, so they're sort of top-down approaches of doing it. Now, I thought perhaps I'd ask you now to try and use the chat to evaluate what you think about these different methods. So the first question is, how much is your teaching shaped by an explicit pedagogical approach, such as student-centered learning? So I'm asking you here, not just sort of at a theoretical level, but actually at a practical level, where do you think, to a very high level, it's something that you're continuously trying to do all the time, or whether you think perhaps hardly at all, or whether you think perhaps, to some degree in the middle? So I'd like you in the chat, if we can try this. I know it's a bit of a sort of clumsy method, but I thought it might be easier to use than using some kind of separate polling. To enter a number into the chat to say how much you think your own teaching is determined by some kind of particular pedagogical approach. If you can all enter a number in, and then perhaps that's it, someone has started to do it. So if people can put a number in, that's right. So I can see some 3s and 2s. So we can get a sort of feeling of where people stand on this, as to whether they feel that the. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. That sort of gives me a feeling. So people are kind of hanging on in the middle there. We haven't got any sort of so far. We haven't got anyone who's admitted that they're right at the extreme end. Thank you. Okay, people are sort of positioning themselves fairly well in the middle. Okay, what about if we go on to the second question, where I'm asking you to think about teacher standards. Now, it may be that you're not even familiar with what the teacher standards in your country are, but if you know what they are, if there are national standards which set down what competencies teachers should have, in your country, it'd be interesting to know how much you think these standards are actually shaping your daily teaching, whether they're having an influence upon you. So can I ask you in this question too, to now turn your attention to what extent you think your teaching is determined by your national standards? Here the score is possibly a little bit higher, than 3s and 4s rather than 2s. Oh, I spoke too soon. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Okay, so maybe perhaps a little bit higher overall, and this very, very approximate sort of polling method that I'm used. And then if we turn lastly to professional development, I mean, one of the issues about professional development is that sometimes it doesn't match very well with the teaching you're having to do at the moment. I mean, it's difficult for CPD to have that connection because sometimes you have to book it quite a long time in advance, and CPD has to be planned for quite a lot of people. But the question is, does the professional development that you get, does it have a big influence upon your teaching? Does it actually change the way you're teaching from day to day? So I'm asking people to give a 4 or a 5 if you think it is having a high impact. Here we seem to be getting a sort of the highest score. So it looks as though of the 3, professional development is perhaps the most influential, but only at the margin. Okay, thank you very much for that. Thank you for those people. You can keep responding while we're going on if you like. So these perhaps then are some of the limits to these top-down methods of change. I mean, I think the obvious point is that teachers are adults. They know a lot about teaching. They may have been teaching for 20, 30 years, and they simply may not be persuaded by non-teachers, by policymakers, that a certain way of teaching generally makes sense. They have their own practices. They've invested a lot over time to develop them, and they're familiar with them and comfortable with them. So even though they may be told that a new way of teaching has come out and that lots of researchers say that it works, it's not necessarily going to be the case that they're going to change their teaching. And all of us, I think, in our professional life, we've got reason to trust that which we've used, that which we worked, that which we can, predict what's going to happen. rather than experimenting. And of course, as teachers, if we're overloaded and if we feel we're going to get into trouble when we fail, that doesn't encourage us to take massive risks. Um, Another point which I think is fairly made is that teachers have seen a lot of changes happen. They've seen a lot of governments come and go. They've seen a lot of new theories about teaching come and go. And therefore, they don't really expect the latest idea or the latest policy to last. They think it might last as long as the minister lasts. They don't think it's going to last any longer than the government lasts. And therefore, the resistance to changing teaching, to rewriting programs, if these new ideas are not going to last very long. Um, uh, or they may feel that these ideas are over idealistic, that they're not really going to work in practice, that they're the sort of ideas that people come up with who are not having to do the job themselves. Or perhaps they think it's a good idea, but they think it would be a massive amount of work. I mean, I think the point can fairly be made about personalized learning, that if you really are personalizing learning, and to some extent we have had to do that during COVID, then it's an enormous amount of work. I mean, each lesson has to be, you know, planned for many, if not as many individuals as there are in the class, certainly for a large number of groups. Therefore, it increases the workload. Um, Teachers also take the point that some of these ideas or approaches are not relevant to their subject, or they're not relevant to their students, and that CPD is maybe not effective if it doesn't connect to the immediate tasks. I mean, very often CPD is associated with some change in regulation or with a new curriculum. It's not connected closely to the lessons that we're planning to teach next week or the week after, and therefore it's difficult for us to actually put it into practice. I want to explore some different ways of directly sharing practice from teacher to teacher, because I think that there are these limitations to top-down sharing, and while it doesn't mean that top-down sharing doesn't have a value, I think we need to think about how perhaps in some cases it's better for teachers to share directly with one another, and in some cases even these top-down ideas can be complemented by direct sharing. So whether it's sharing by meeting, or whether it's sharing by blogging or using social media, I want us to explore some of the alternatives which are available. But before I look at these sharing, I'd just like to explore some different ways of teaching and learning, because I think these are relevant not only to how students learn, but they're also very relevant to the way that teachers learn. So, I mean, a standard distinction is between what we call tacit and discursive teaching and learning. So tacit learning is the sort of more primitive, the more instinctive learning that we all do when we're young. It's obvious to us that we're doing it when we're young, and it's obvious to us that other animals apart from humans do it. It's face-to-face learning from trusted individuals when we learn a language from our mother, as when we learn behaviors from our friends or from our siblings. Um, it's relational and social. We mimic the way other people are behaving. And who they are matters enormously to us about whether we trust them and whether we mimic them or not. The learning may be unconscious. Um, we attend to something, and of course these are very important things in what we do in the classroom. I mean, quite often in the classroom we use these tacit forms of teaching and learning to get the class to have a shared attention for something we want them to attend to. Or if we're trying to teach a skill, we might model that skill and show that skill to people so that they can copy it, or so that they can view it and remember it. On the other hand, we've got what we call discursive teaching and learning, which is very much language based. It takes advantage of language. Ideas and facts are wrapped up in propositions. It's impersonal. It's the kind of knowledge which I suppose robots could, or computers could teach, because it doesn't need to be taught from anyone in particular. It's portable across time and space. And of course, it does have the advantage that it's relatively easy to test. I mean, claims that people make, statements they make, can be checked and can be tested, which of course is much more difficult with the kind of tacit learning where you're being influenced by others. You're not so critical about it. But of course, if we think of changing our practice as teachers, changing the way we teach, changing the way we work with our learners, it seems to me that it's not just facts and knowledge which are important. I mean, sure, we're going to want to know what works. Sure, we're going to need to understand these theories of pedagogy or these standards, but often I think what might make us actually change our behavior is having contact with another teacher who can make that work, or seeing how it works for another teacher. What I'm getting at is that while this kind of knowledge is far more complete and in some ways far more scientific and general, this kind of knowledge and learning can be more influential upon our behavior and can affect us more deeply. And if teachers are going to learn from one another, then it's tacit as well as factual or discursive knowledge which is going to be important. And therefore, if we want that kind of transfer to happen, we need to think about tacit as well as discursive learning. Okay, so so the first kind of collaborative learning I wanted the first kind of sort of sharing I wanted to talk about a little bit was what we call collaborative projects. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, I mean, I think you're probably familiar with what it means to work with other teachers on a project together. And I wanted to talk a little bit about a particular project that I've been involved in, just in order to give an example. So in this particular project, which is a project which has been going on in Serbia, teachers from different subjects have been coming together to create a learning for their students, which was combined from their different disciplines, their different subjects. And because the learning was drawn from different subjects, it gave everyone involved, the students and the teachers, the impression of being more realistic, of connecting somehow to the real world and to real problems in the world, rather than to just the stuff that goes on in school. The teachers planned the teaching and the learning together, and therefore they were compelled to learn from one another. I mean, they learned about one another's goals in teaching their subjects, but they also learned about the ways that these teachers would normally teach their subject. I think perhaps the most important thing for these teachers is that working together, they had a bit more confidence and a bit more courage to try and do things a bit differently. They were motivated by one another not to do things the way they'd done before. I mean, it's perhaps not clear why people in a group like that should be willing to be a bit more experimental than people by themselves, but it does seem often to be the case that bringing teachers together, giving them an opportunity to learn in this way, does make them a bit more willing to try something a bit different. Apart from anything else, you get a little bit more recognition. If you're just working by yourself, the only recognition you get is that from your students. And if you're working with other teachers, then you get professional recognition, and that can encourage you to learn a bit and to try things out a bit. Clearly, in this case, there was tacit as well as discursive learning, because the teachers were learning from one another. Of course, on the downside, there were meetings, there was communication, there was coordination. And of course, the other point about this kind of work is some teachers gain more than others. And the learning from all the teachers in the group is not equal. And of course, that's not entirely fair. Some teachers may feel that they're making a big input, and other teachers are sort of gaining more. I'd be interested to get some idea really of what experience you've had of collaborative learning, and whether you think that this is relevant to your approach to teaching. So, I mean, I guess if you haven't had much experience of collaborative teaching, of learning collaboratively and teaching that way, you should give yourself a low mark here. But if you think that it's something which is relevant to the way you've been teaching, and it's something which you find connects to what you're trying to do in your teaching, you should score it 5. So can I ask you please to try and score the relevance of this kind of collaborative way of working to your own teaching? So thank you, Milada, you've come in there. So quite a spread of marks here, a big variety in how people are scoring it. So interestingly, quite a lot of teachers just don't seem to find this very relevant, perhaps because they're working in a system where there's just not much opportunity for them to come together. It is true in some systems where teachers have quite heavy workloads and they're teaching a lot of lessons that there just really isn't a great deal of time for them to collaborate. And this is pretty frustrating, and it limits the amount of innovation and experiment that can go on. I mean, we can't really see very easily whether there are particular countries here where there's a higher level of collaboration going on than others. I mean, it is said, for example, that in some very successful systems, teachers are given, they're programmed a certain amount of time every week where they are expected to collaborate. And that's, very much part of what's expected of them. And therefore, that builds collaboration into their work. Thank you. And if we go to the second question now, the second question is not so much asking whether it's relevant, but whether you think this kind of collaboration actually does change the way you work. I mean, whether you just go on the same way as you did before, or whether in fact, if you do this kind of combined teaching with others and you're exposed over, a decent period of time, a few months, as it were, to teaching with them, whether that actually will or has in the past changed the way you're teaching. So can I ask you to respond to this question too here, whether you think it will actually have a big effect upon your teaching? I mean, in this project, which I'm working with in Serbia, with a number of Serbian teachers, it does seem to have had that effect. I think in Serbia, it's a feature of vocational teaching that things are very divided. The theory teacher is separate from the practice teacher. There's very little connection between them, and the theory and the vocational subjects are very separate from the language teaching. So putting these together has been actually had quite a big shock and quite a big influence on the teachers, and they're a little bit surprised about why they didn't try and do it before, because in some ways it seems quite obvious. But in the case of these groups of teachers in Serbia, I think that I've given the link to Nicholas about this project. Maybe you'd like to post it in the chat, Nicholas, so that if people want to, they can read more about this project in Serbia. Yelena says that in Montenegro, opinions are divided, and I think that's right. And I wouldn't say that everything should be done in a collaborative way. I think I think that doesn't suit everyone, and I think, to be honest, if it was done too much, it becomes rather laborious. It becomes too much of the same thing. But I do think that it can be a great opportunity for teachers to learn, and then perhaps to try some of the things they've learned from their colleagues by themselves, without necessarily collaborating all the time. Going on to another way of teacher to teacher cooperation and sharing, which many organizations such as eTwinning for a start, and my own organization, the European Training Foundation, supports, are networks where there are opportunities for teachers to share their practice with teachers in other schools. So all of these networks, or the international ones at least, give teachers an opportunity to, go beyond their own school. Because clearly within your school you have opportunities to talk to your colleagues, although that's not always what's expected of you. Not every staff room, quite often in staff rooms, you're really not expected to be sharing practice, but you're expected to be relaxing and taking a step back from your teaching. But networks do give the opportunity to ask questions. You can very often search by profile or by theme. For example, to find out what people are doing with new technology, or to use some sort of matchmaking functionality to identify people who are tackling similar problems to yourself. There is the possibility with the networking coming back time and again. The great thing about the network is it's a kind of sharing which can be sustained over time, whereas other kinds of meeting, it's much more difficult to do that. On the downside, there's quite a lot of noise, there's quite a lot of stuff going on there, which perhaps is of less interest to you. Uh, Nicholas, perhaps you could share also in the link, in the chat, the link to the community that I've mentioned there, so people. Oh, thank you. Clearly there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of other information going on which perhaps is not of great interest to you. There are language barriers, and of course in a large network it's a bit difficult to build trust. A lot of teachers prefer much smaller networks, where perhaps there's sort of 20 or so people, where it's much easier to build trust, and therefore people open up and are ready to talk about their practice. Not always easy to enter into a community. It's easy to enter in a formal sense, but it's a bit more difficult, I think, to develop relationships within a network, so that people within that network that you really want to exchange with. It'd be interesting to know whether people out there are members of international networks like this kind, and if so, if they're members of many networks. Um, can I ask all of you, are you members of international networks for teachers? Could you just say yes or no, just to give me a feeling about whether you're actually participating in such international networks in the chat? No, yes. So maybe it's looking 50% or so. E-twinnings, obviously. So quite a lot of people, coming in and saying yes. So I don't know. I don't know how positively you rate such networks. Clearly, they don't all deliver all that they promise. Who would rate such a network they're in as something as being very, very positive for gaining practices, for acquiring new ideas of new practical ways in their teaching? Could I ask you to give a score out of 5? 5 if you're finding these networks really useful for your teaching, but 1 if you're not finding them so useful. So yeah, there's quite a lot of sort of positive rating of networks coming out of here. E-twinning is particularly rated by some users. E-twinning, of course, gives the possibility for direct contact school to school, and that's an opportunity to move sort of beyond the network into a more direct, sometimes into a collaborative situation. Often in e-twinning, schools come together to do a collaborative project together, and therefore they can benefit from the more intense kind of cooperation that you have in collaboration. And I guess there's a interface. A network can lead to a closer collaboration, and it can help you to decide which is the worthwhile collaboration, and to avoid the ones which would be a waste of time. I'm going to move on from this because we've already discussed this. if I can. With some difficulty. Okay, so I wanted to go on to talk about another. How am I doing for time? I'm okay for time. If I wanted to talk about another way of sharing, so another way of sharing is to have what's called a reference model. I'm going to see if I can share my screen to show you what this looks like. I think that Niklaus has put this already into the chat, but I think I can show you also what this looks like for those of you who are not. So I'm hoping that you can see that. So this is a model, a reference model to share with teachers different ways of teaching. It's at quite a high level of generality, I suppose, but it's distilled from a lot of research about what new skills and practices teachers require, teachers are demonstrating currently. So it's looking to try and have an understanding of contemporary teacher practice. It's not a standard. It's not saying what teachers ought to do, but it's trying to gather together all sorts of pictures of what teachers are doing and try and put them together in a bit of a holistic way. So we have the notion that teaching should be learner driven, that it should be adaptable, that it should address sustainability and inclusion. And if we go into these if we drill into, shall we say, learner driven, for example, we find that unpacked into sort of different ideas about what learner driven teaching is, that it should foster meaningful learning, that it should facilitate peer and team learning. And then these ideas are themselves unpacked to give ideas about what that might mean in practice. So teachers might be expected to collect and analyze information about learners' interests to engage them in relevant real-life learning experiences. That teachers might design and implement authentic learner-driven activities that accommodate learners' needs. And so it's just a way of exploring, I suppose, different aspects of teaching and trying to sort of put these together a bit to get a sort of comprehensive picture of what might be involved in teaching, what the different dimensions are, and helping teachers perhaps to explore what other teachers are doing. So it comes away, I guess, from looking at particular examples, but it's not supposed to be sort of dictating to teachers exactly what they're supposed to be doing. Okay, so let me come back to my presentation if I can. I think I've come back to my presentation. Yeah, I'm running out of time a little bit. So am I back to my presentation?
Yes, we can see it perfectly.
So I'm going to sort of, yeah, I mean, I think I've summarized the sort of positive aspects of that. It can be a vision. It can be useful to inspire a whole school and not just teachers. Possibly on the other hand, it can seem a little bit unrealistic, a bit excessive to an individual teacher, and teachers need to find ways of sort of making sense of it. Yeah, I'm going to attempt, if I can, just to sort of show you another way of sharing good practice. This is the notion of teacher advocates. So the idea here is that particular teachers can advocate a way of teaching, can share to many other teachers, their preferred approach. Quite often videos are used in order to sort of personalize this. Let me see if I can get this to work. I'm not entirely sure I'm going to manage it, but I'll have a go. let's. Okay, so this is a page in my organization, the European Training Foundation's website, where there are a number of what we call teacher boosters. And these teacher boosters are individual teachers who talk about their practice. This is a teacher, Eva Stojanvoska. These are each teachers who describe their practice. They teach different subjects. And it's a way of hearing, as it were, directly from a teacher, some ideas about their teaching. Okay. I think perhaps I won't. I don't know. Let me see if I can give you a bit of example. This is a very topical one because it's a Ukrainian teacher.
My name is Roman Shiyan. I have spent my entire life working for the better education system for Ukraine. And now I will tell you the story of a former Soviet country which is completely reshaping its education system. Our recent history is marked by strong social movements, changes in regime and government. Despite the social shocks, or maybe thanks to them, Ukraine has come a long way from a Soviet system to a place where teachers are taking the lead and redefining our curriculum. The new Ukrainian school puts key competences at the center. Let me tell you how we were able to turn the revolution into the window of opportunity for education reform.
Okay, we lost the presentation just for a second.
Yeah, no, I switched it back because
Yeah.
Although it's a terrific a terrific example, because it's a Ukrainian teacher talking about the educational reform in Ukraine and what he as a teacher tried to do. I don't want today to explore that in too much detail, but I'm just giving you an example of how it's an opportunity to see the perspective from a particular teacher in a particular country at a particular point in time. And I think that is a great opportunity. So this is another way, and it's something which I guess some of you might be interested in contributing to, because there are opportunities these days for teachers to put across their own approach. So it's teacher to teacher. Obviously, there's scope for inspiration, for credibility. It's more possible to believe in a teacher when they speak to you about teaching than from an outsider. On the downside, I suppose it can seem exceptional. It can seem that these individuals are not like ordinary teachers, and therefore what they do is not possible for other people. It can also seem sometimes that the advocates are, not addressing my problem, but they're addressing some other problem. But I do think increasingly, as it becomes easier for people to use simple technology to capture their own practice and to describe it, and it becomes much easier for us to share that, these sorts of simple teacher-to-teacher accounts, can do more and can be a better way for us to share practice between one another. I'm feeling that I'm running out of time a little bit now. If I had more time, I would mention the opportunities for work placements, where vocational teachers go and work in industry. They work closely with employers or with workers, and they have an opportunity to learn directly from them, face to face, in a direct, tacit manner. But of course, these are not always available for people. I want to pause there. There's sort of further information on the last slide, but I'd like to leave a little bit of time for people to ask questions. So there are a couple of questions there, but I don't think that the ones that I can answer. I think, Marta, you'd have to pick those up.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation, and definitely, yes, we have time now for some questions. Would it be okay for you if I read them out loud so then you can reply?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, perfectly. So, one first question would be, Based on the practices and approaches described during the presentation, do you believe that a combination of them, for instance, network and personal stories, such as the ones in the Teaching Booster, are more effective? Have you ever experienced something like that?
I think the answer is we don't know which is most effective. I don't think there is research which shows which is most effective. I mean, my own view is that, you know, what we need of teachers is that they are confident to make good judgments. It's not something which I think that schools or government should say to teachers. I think teachers need training, and they need to be able to make the call themselves about which kinds of collaboration are going to work best for them. Whether they are going to, you know, focus on one particular kind of sharing, or whether you know, whether they're going to combine them. I think they need the judgment, because I think depending on what you're trying to do, depending on what system you're in, depending on what you're trying to teach, you know, different forms of sharing are going to be more or less effective. But perhaps what I do think is I do think that some kind of sharing is essential, and I think it is a weakness. It is a weakness in teaching that too often teachers are struggling to solve all the problems themselves, and therefore they're just missing opportunities to learning. And we did some research in my organization about digital skills during COVID, and we discovered that even within one school, there were some teachers who had high levels of digital competence and were coping well with the crisis, and other teachers who were not. So even within a single school, there were enormous gaps in teachers' capacity to cope with the challenge. But if you look from school to school, I think, you know, the differences are going to be even greater.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And well, before we close, I would like to remind the participants that my colleague has posted the feedback form in the chat, and we would like to hear from you as well. So please remember to save the link, and you can complete the form after the webinar. And actually, one more question before we close, if you have the time to stay with us. They were asking how can we safeguard the effectiveness and sustainability of teachers' networks?
Well, it's tough. It's tough, and the reality is, you know, networks are created, and they don't always last. I mean, you know, I mean, and of course, sometimes that's not bad. You know what I mean? I mean, sometimes a network is created for a certain limited purpose. Um, you know, to support a particular change which is going on between a group of teachers at a certain time. And I don't think that, you know, networks should always last forever. You know, um, I think you have to plan it carefully, and you have to decide. You know, you have to decide realistically what the network is intended to do and how long it should last. I mean, we set up a network for teachers of plumbing in Albania, a small network a few years ago, and that's still running. I mean, it's only a Facebook network, but it does engage. The teachers do find it useful, and they continue to use it, even though it's on a very small scale. But I think there are other networks which we've set up which have come to an end after a fairly short period of time. And I think if the network isn't of any use to anyone, or if it's, you know, I mean, if there aren't a reasonable number of people contributing, then they're probably not of any use. And then I think you have to accept that, okay, it didn't really meet people's needs, and let's move on to do something else. I think that I think there's a particular value in small networks where people develop a strong relationship with one another. I think in some of these larger networks, it can remain a bit superficial. people are not engaging very deeply. There's not a very high level of trust. So I do think that it's some of the smaller networks have got a particular value, or perhaps sometimes in the larger networks where you have smaller groups which exist within that larger network, where people come to know one another, they have an engagement, they're ready to help people, they trust them, they're willing to admit problems. I think that's where the greatest learning goes on.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I tend to agree with you since my experiences with the e-twinning community, but I do agree that networks and communities are created and because there is a common need, let's say. So they might last in the time, but needs change. So it really depends. Regarding the reason why these networks are built and so on. Okay, I think we are moving towards the closing. Just a practical information for the audience. No certificates are issued for this webinar, but if you sign in on the sheet that my colleague shared before, you can have it registered on your portfolio as usual. Okay, on the behalf of the CSS and the twinning team, thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for the presentation. I remind all the participants also that the recording and the slides will be available. Yeah. Okay, I think, Julian, I maybe would like to give you the floor again for one last comment or suggestion that you have for our teachers, participants, or anything you would like to share before we close.
I think that I think people should be ready to experiment a little bit. I think that I think it's a very tough job being a teacher, and I think that we're missing out on some of the companionship which teachers can give one another. You know, some schools provide that because there's a really good sort of spirit in that school, but not all schools do. And I know that in most countries in Europe and outside of Europe, a lot of people don't last as teachers, or if they do last as teachers, they get discontent, they get disillusioned. So I think that as professionals, as teachers, we have a responsibility for one another, and we should be looking for ways to share our practice, to share ideas, to share our enthusiasm, and to encourage one another, but also when we need it to get encouragement from one another. Unless we do that, I think we're not going to reach our full capacity. And I say that as someone who perhaps has too much of his time worked by myself, and perhaps has too much of my time have tried to solve problems by myself. But I increasingly see that was a mistake, and that we gain by reaching out, by giving, but also by learning from one another.
Thank you very much again. I would like now to wish you all a good evening. Thank you for joining us for this hour today. I think it was really inspireful and you got a lot of ideas. And please, as Julian said before, check also the links that you find in the presentation. Okay, bye-bye, everyone. Have a nice evening.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.